For more than a decade, one figure on Pawn Star stood apart from the rest of the cast. She wasn't loud. She wasn't looking to make a deal. She walked into the gold and silver pawn shop, picked up a 200-year-old book like it was made of glass, and in a few calm sentences either made someone's day or crushed their dreams. Her name is Rebecca Romney, and while millions of viewers came to know her as the Book Lady, almost none of them know the real story of how she got there, or what actually happened to her once the cameras stopped rolling as often as they used to. This is the untold truth about Rebecca Romney. Rebecca Angeline Romney was born in 1985 and raised in the Las Vegas area, which makes her origin story a little different from what most fans assume. She wasn't a Vegas outsider dropped into the pawn shop world by casting agents. She grew up there. Long before she ever appraised anything under studio lighting, she was a kid in a household that valued reading and ideas over almost everything else. In interviews later in her career, she's described coming from what she calls a reading family, a household of scientifically minded people who nonetheless filled the shelves with science fiction and fantasy. That detail matters because it explains something that surprises people who only know her from television. Rebecca isn't a stuffy academic who only respects leather-bound classics. Her personal collecting interests, to this day, lean toward genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and romance novels, genres the traditional antiquarian book world has historically looked down on. That instinct to take unserious genres seriously would end up defining much of her later career. But as a teenager, she wasn't thinking about rare books at all. Language was her first love. She had disagreements with her parents about whether to pursue the sciences or the humanities, and the humanities won. She developed a serious interest in linguistics and classical studies, eventually putting together a college education that combined a double major in classics and linguistics with a minor in philosophy. Along the way, she picked up real fluency in French and Latin, working knowledge of several other languages, and even spent time abroad teaching English in Japan while she was a student. This wasn't a hobbyist dabbling. It was the kind of rigorous, multi-year language training that later let her look at antique documents, letterpress printing, and centuries-old handwriting and actually understand what she was looking at, rather than just guessing at value. None of this pointed toward reality television. If you had told 18-year-old Rebecca that she'd spend her career on a cable show appraising pawned heirlooms in front of a national audience, she probably would have laughed. Her plan, as much as she had one, was academic. Keep studying language and philosophy, maybe end up teaching or translating. Rare books weren't on the radar. The turning point came in 2007, right around the time she graduated. Bauman Rare Books, one of the most respected names in the American antiquarian book trade, was opening a new gallery location in Las Vegas, Rebecca's hometown. She applied for a position there, and by her own later account, she didn't fully grasp what the job actually involved until she was already in the building. She wasn't a lifelong book collector angling for her dream job. She was a recent graduate who needed work, walked into an interview, and found herself hired into one of the most specialized trades in the world: authenticating, cataloging, and selling books and manuscripts worth tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's tempting to romanticize this as an overnight discovery of a hidden talent, but the truth is more grounded and, honestly, more impressive. Rebecca had to learn the rare book trade from the ground up, on the job, while it happened to be a trade that rewarded exactly the skills she already had: careful textual analysis, knowledge of historical printing and language, and patience for detail work most people would find mind-numbing. Her academic background in classics and linguistics wasn't wasted after all. It turned out to be perfect preparation for a field she'd stumbled into almost by accident. Bauman's Las Vegas gallery opened to the public in early 2008, and Rebecca was there from the start. She moved up quickly. By 2010, just a few years after being hired, she was managing that gallery. It's worth pausing on how unusual that is. The antiquarian book trade is a small, insular, and historically male-dominated world, filled with people who spent decades building reputations before being trusted with truly valuable material. Rebecca went from newcomer to gallery manager in roughly 3 years, handling inventory that included Shakespeare folios, leaves from the Gutenberg Bible, and first editions of foundational scientific texts like Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. Getting handed that level of responsibility that quickly says something about how fast she'd absorb the trade. Here's where the popular version of Rebecca's story and the actual version diverge in an interesting way. Many fans assume producers went looking for a rare book expert to fill out the Pawn Stars, cast the same way they cast other specialists, cold, through some kind of talent search. That's not what happened. Rick Harrison, who had been running gold and silver pawn shops since 1989, ran in the same small Las Vegas circles as people in the antiques and collectibles trade. Bauman's Las Vegas location wasn't some anonymous shop to him. It was a business he already knew about in a city where high-value dealers tend to be aware of each other. When Pawn Stars first approached Bauman about having Rebecca appear on the show, the company initially said no. According to Rebecca's own account of it, Rick didn't take that answer and quietly move on. He came back and kept pressing the issue. By the time he'd worn down that resistance, Rebecca was already the one managing the gallery, which put her in the position of being the person to say yes. It's a small but telling detail. Rebecca's arrival on Pawn Stars wasn't the result of a producer's casting decision. It came from Rick Harrison personally pushing to get her on camera because he already trusted her judgment on paper, ink, and old documents before a single episode aired. That's a very different origin story than TV expert hired for a role. And it goes a long way toward explaining why the on-screen rapport between Rebecca and the shop's regular cast always felt genuine rather than scripted. It was built on a real professional relationship that predated the show. She made her first appearance in the show's fourth season, which aired in 2011, credited on screen simply as the manager of Bauman's Las Vegas gallery. From that first episode, something clicked with audiences. Where other specialists on the show sometimes leaned into showmanship, Rebecca's appeal was almost the opposite. She was measured. She spoke plainly about complicated material without talking down to anyone, and she never seemed rattled by the size of the numbers she was dealing with, whether she was about to make someone's day or take a sledgehammer to their hopes. Fans started calling her the Book Lady, and for the next several years, whenever anything made of paper walked through the shop's doors, books, letters, historical documents, autographs, she was the one they called. Over her run on Pawn Stars, Rebecca handled an extraordinary range of material, and the stories that stuck with fans tend to fall into two categories: the time she saved someone from a costly mistake, and the time she uncovered something genuinely remarkable. One of the most fondly remembered moments involves Chum Lee, the shop employee frequently the butt of jokes for questionable purchases. In an early season, Chum Lee spent money out of the shop's stock budget on a book he believed carried the signature of aviator Charles Lindbergh. The catch was that the signature read Mark Lindbergh, not Charles, an error that had everyone in the shop assuming the whole thing was a fake, with Chum Lee facing real consequences for the bad buy. Rebecca examined it and was able to explain how Lindbergh's signature style had shifted over the years as he became more famous, distinguishing a genuine but unusual autograph from an obvious forgery. Her verdict turned what looked like a disaster into a legitimate, profitable purchase, and it's remained one of the show's more memorable expert saves the day moments precisely because it hinged on a detail, evolving handwriting over a public figure's lifetime, that most people would never think to check. She was also the person who could deliver bad news without ever raising her voice. Fans and cast members alike have pointed out that her calmest, most matter-of-fact tone often showed up right when she was about to explain that something wasn't what a seller hoped it was, a Shakespeare folio that didn't hold up to scrutiny, a document with the wrong kind of aging in the paper, ink that looked too clean for its supposed age. She built a reputation for being able to identify forgeries through small physical details that separate real historical material from convincing fakes. The texture of period-appropriate paper, the behavior of ink over time, the absence of the tiny imperfections you'd expect in something centuries old. On the other end of the spectrum, she also got to be the bearer of genuinely exciting news. Handling genuine first editions of major scientific and literary works, the kind of books that reshaped entire fields of human thought, was a regular part of her work both at Bauman and on the show. Appraising something like an authentic early printing of a landmark scientific or literary text and explaining, in real time, why it matters historically, and what actually justifies its value, was where her academic training and her trade experience came together most visibly. Later in the show's run, even after her appearances became less frequent, she continued to show up occasionally for standout cases. In one widely discussed later season episode, a seller brought in a journal connected to the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804, the journey that helped map the vast western territory the United States had acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. The seller wanted a substantial sum for it, but Rebecca pointed out that library ownership markings on the item significantly hurt its value as a collectible, and the final sale price came in far below the original ask. It's a good example of what made her valuable to the show for so long. She wasn't just there to say real or fake. She understood the layered, sometimes unglamorous factors, provenance markings, condition, prior ownership history, that actually determine what something is worth in the collector's market. If you spent any time in Pawn Stars fan forums or watched enough YouTube retrospectives, you may have come across a specific and dramatic story. That in 2014, a stolen rare book worth tens of thousands of dollars appeared on the show, that the FBI got involved, that Rebecca herself was personally questioned by federal agents, and that this scandal is the real, hidden reason she quietly disappeared from the cast without explanation. It's a compelling story. It's also not something that holds up under scrutiny. There is no verifiable reporting, no court record, no law enforcement statement, no contemporaneous news coverage that confirms this chain of events happened as described. It appears to be one of those stories that took shape gradually across forums and video essays, where each retelling added a little more specific detail, specific dollar figures, specific dates, and alleged FBI interview, without any of it tracing back to a documented source. That doesn't mean nothing unusual ever happened around any item on the show. Pawn shops that deal in secondhand goods occasionally do encounter items with disputed ownership, and that's true industry-wide, not unique to one shop or one appraiser. But the specific cinematic version of this story, with Rebecca cast as someone under federal suspicion, isn't something that can be backed up with real evidence. This matters for two reasons. First, it's simply not fair to repeat unverified claims about a real person's supposed brush with federal law enforcement as though it were established fact, especially when there's a much more mundane, well-documented explanation for the thing the rumor is trying to explain. Second, the actual explanation is arguably a better story anyway, because it's a story about a woman making a deliberate, unglamorous life decision rather than fleeing a scandal. The real reason Rebecca's appearances on Pawn Stars became less frequent starting around the middle of the 2010s is straightforward. She got married and moved. In 2016, she married J.P. Romney, an author. Her husband is from the Philadelphia area, and shortly afterward, she relocated there. Bauman Rare Books, the company she had worked for since 2007, had a Philadelphia location as part of its operation, and moving there let her continue working for the same firm in a more senior capacity, eventually handling library acquisitions and catalog production at a higher level than her original Las Vegas gallery management role. Since Pawn Stars films primarily around the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas, moving across the country naturally meant she could no longer be a weekly or even monthly fixture on set. She didn't vanish because of scandal. She relocated because of marriage and a career opportunity within the same company she'd worked for nearly a decade. The kind of decision plenty of people make, just one that happened to affect a television show's cast list. It's also worth noting she never fully left. Even after the move, she continued to appear on the show periodically whenever she was back in Las Vegas or when a case called for her specific expertise, making her one of the longest-running specialists in the show's history and, notably, the only woman who held a recurring specialist role across that many years. She's continued to be listed as the show's rare book specialist on her own professional materials, not as some kind of contractual leftover, but because the relationship with the show never actually ended. It just became less frequent as her life and career moved elsewhere. Through her marriage to J.P. Romney, she also became connected by marriage to the extended Romney political family, including a distant relation to 2012 presidential candidate Mitt Romney. It's the kind of detail that generates online curiosity precisely because it sounds significant, but by Rebecca's own account, the connection is exactly what it looks like on paper, a distant in-law relationship with no real personal relationship behind it. She has been direct in interviews that she has never actually met Mitt Romney, and she has generally avoided discussing the family connection at all, treating it as a footnote rather than a talking point. Her marriage to JP later ended, but by then their most significant joint project, a book, had already made its mark. In 2017, Rebecca and JP Romney published Printer's Error, irreverent stories from book history together. It wasn't a dry academic text. The book dug into strange, half-forgotten episodes from the history of printing and publishing. Stories about forged editions, copyright fights between famous authors and their publishers, and the odd, sometimes embarrassing mistakes woven into the history of the printed word. It combined Rebecca's real trade expertise with JP's storytelling instincts, and the pairing worked. The book found a genuine audience beyond people who already followed her from television, giving her a credibility in the literary and publishing world that a reality TV appearance alone never could have provided. That project mattered for her career in a way that's easy to overlook if you only know her as the woman from Pawn Stars. It repositioned her, in the eyes of critics and the book trade, as someone with real authority on the history of the printed object. Not just someone who could tell a real book from a fake one on camera, but someone who understood and could explain the deeper, stranger history of how books get made, mishandled, faked, and fought over. Television exposure gave Rebecca a public profile, but it was never the foundation of her actual career, and she seems to have understood that distinction clearly from early on. From 2016 to 2019, she worked at Honey and Wax Booksellers, continuing to build trade experience and relationships in a rare book market centered increasingly on the East Coast rather than Las Vegas. In 2019, she took the next step and co-founded her own firm, Type Punch Matrix, based in the Washington, D.C. area, alongside bookseller Brian Cassidy, who brought his own decade-plus of specialized experience, particularly in 20th century literary movements and printing technology. Type Punch Matrix wasn't built as a novelty shop trading on Rebecca's television fame. It positioned itself as a serious generalist rare book firm, dealing across genres and eras. Everything from Shakespeare folios and Gutenberg Bible leaf to the genre fiction Rebecca had always personally cared about, including a notable specialization in the history of the romance novel as a literary form, an area the traditional trade has often dismissed, but which she has actively worked to have taken seriously as a subject of serious collecting and scholarship. Alongside her book-dealing career, Rebecca also built a parallel reputation as someone actively trying to change who gets taken seriously in the world of book collecting. In 2017, she and fellow bookseller Heather O'Donnell co-founded the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize, an annual award recognizing outstanding book collections built by women 30 or younger living in the United States. The prize wasn't about the monetary value of a collection. It was about original thinking. The idea that a genuinely interesting, well-researched collection built around a personal obsession is worth celebrating just as much as a collection built around expense. The prize has continued for years, recognizing collectors with backgrounds and interests far outside the traditional stereotype of who a serious book collector is supposed to be. She's also remained active as an educator in her field, serving on the faculty of programs like the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar, a training ground for the next generation of rare book professionals, and sitting on the board of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. These aren't the kinds of credentials that show up in a TV recap, but they represent the parts of her career that actually carry weight within the trade itself. The difference between being a television personality who happens to know about books and being a respected professional who happens to have also been on television. In 2019, Rebecca was featured in The Booksellers, a documentary exploring the rare book trade centered largely in New York, which premiered at the New York Film Festival at Lincoln Center. The film gave her a platform to speak about the trade in a context entirely separate from Pawn Stars, discussing the culture, economics, and eccentricities of antiquarian bookselling among peers rather than for a mass television audience looking for the next big appraisal reveal. Reviewers responded to her presence in the film, with at least one prominent trade publication singling her out among the documentary's subjects for her clear-eyed, enthusiastic perspective on the profession. Then, in February 2025, Rebecca released Jane Austen's Bookshelf, a book that marked a genuine turning point in how she talked publicly about her own field. The book examines the women writers who influenced and surrounded Jane Austen. Authors like Frances Burney and Radcliffe and Charlotte Smith, who were commercially successful and critically respected in their own time, but have since been largely written out of the literary canon, while male contemporaries with comparable or lesser commercial success remained in print and in classrooms. Rebecca has been candid that she didn't set out to write a book about erasure. She started by simply collecting the books these women wrote, hunting through auctions and estate sales for original editions that had become genuinely hard to find. And the deeper she went into the collecting, the more she realized how thoroughly these authors had been dropped from literary history despite Austen herself having read and been shaped by their work. She's been unusually honest about her own blind spots in talking about the book, acknowledging publicly that she went through years of formal education in classics and literature and years working as a rare book professional without seriously encountering most of these women's work herself. That admission became part of the book's appeal. Rather than presenting herself as someone who'd always known this hidden history, she framed the project as her own process of discovering how thoroughly even a trained expert's education can leave out entire categories of important writers. Jane Austen's Bookshelf was well reviewed on release and sold strongly, expanding her audience yet again, this time among readers interested in literary history and feminist scholarship who might never have watched a single episode of Pawn Stars. By 2025, Rebecca's standing within the antiquarian book trade had reached a level that has almost nothing to do with television recognition. She was invited to deliver a lecture at the Grolier Club in New York, founded in 1884 and widely regarded as the oldest and most prestigious society of book collectors and bibliophiles in the United States, with an extremely limited and highly selective membership. Being asked to lecture there on the research behind Jane Austen's Bookshelf represent a level of institutional respect within the rare book world that a reality television career alone would never earn someone. It reflects the trade's own view of her, not primarily as the woman from Pawn Stars, but as a substantive researcher and dealer whose work stands on its own. Today, Rebecca Romney continues to run-type punch matrix with Brian Cassidy, dealing across genres from Shakespeare to science fiction to the romance novel, while also continuing to write, lecture, and teach the next generation of rare book professionals. She remains connected to Pawn Stars, appearing when the show calls for her expertise and continuing to be recognized as one of its longest-running and most trusted specialists, and its only long-term woman specialist. Even though her day-to-day life is centered far from the Las Vegas set where her television career began, her story resists the version fans sometimes want it to be: a mysterious disappearance, a hidden scandal, a secretive exit under federal scrutiny. What actually happened is less dramatic and, in a way, more admirable. A woman who almost became a philosopher instead became one of the country's most respected rare book dealers by accident, built a television career on top of an already serious professional one, made a deliberate personal choice to prioritize her marriage and her firm's growth over screen time, and then spent the years since using both her platform and her trade knowledge to push an insular, historically male-dominated field to take women collectors, women authors, and genres like romance and science fiction more seriously than it ever had before. She didn't need a scandal to make her interesting. The real story was compelling enough on its own.